Good day, everybody. How's it going out there? As promised in the last video, we're going to do it, ladies and gentlemen. Two videos about the Epstein files. But we're a little bit vain. This is a furry channel. So I'm going to bring it back and bring the topic back and have it sort of have a grounding in furry fandom. Because I've been in the furry fandom since the early 2000s. And the early 2000s was an interesting time to be a furry. If you think things are bad today, things were pretty bad back then. In a more subtle, not so grandiose, government being a blasphemous tongue, it was more subtle than that. And an interesting side effect of that, now that we are in the year 2026, is having hindsight onto problems that were happening behind the curtains while everybody was watching the freak show that was the early 2000s media. Today's thing is going to be talking about Vanity Fair. And a situation that has come to pass and come to fruition over the past year after all these files have been released and all these situations have occurred and the curtain has risen. Now that it has, I think it's a good time to go and look back. If you're short on time and you don't want to listen to me ramble, I put a link to the article in which I write this topic and the topic of the next video. If you want an early sneak peek, wink, 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 wink. I can't wink. I need to get a winky. You can do that in the description below. So let's talk about Vanity Fair. So if you talk to any furry who is of an age and they talk about the bad times with the media before, we focused a little bit more on, talking with media, using media, encouraging people to be more media literate, as well as being, presenting the best foot forward to the media and trying not to squick the media, as it were, with salacious bits. Basically, there was the media filled in the gaps for a lot of things, and things didn't turn out so well. And sometimes they would cling on to the most salacious part of, furry fandom and just run with it. And there's a lot of examples of this. The big three infamous ones that a lot of furries will reference are the MTV's magazine Sex and Sex 2K, which was had an article about furries. There was the CSI, that CSI episode. With the dawning of AI, searching that CSI episode in Google doesn't really put it at the top of the results anymore. It just shows a bunch of CSI episodes. But back in the day, if you typed in that CSI episode, you'd get a particular one called Fur and Loathing in Las Vegas, which, became a pretty infamous phrase in the fandom. And almost as cliche as Pursuit of Happiness. And when it comes to the media and media representation. If I had a dime for every time I heard Pursuit of Happiness used by a publication, I'd at least have $1, and that's a lot of money. Not back in 2001. But basically, the element of it is that Vanity Fair ran an article, and is the third infamous one, and they called Pleasures of the Fur. This article was published in March of 2001. And followed basically a guy by the name of Ostrich, who is an otter. Don't get confused. And they took a photo of him, and it's presented there. I don't know whether or not Ostrich is still a person active in the furry fandom, but this particular thing was what's called a gonzo journalism piece. For those of you who know not familiar with that terminology. Gonzo style journalism, think of it as like a first person narrative where the journalist writer puts themselves as sort of the protagonist of the story ish and kind of goes around and writes what they experienced in sort of a story format in that way, right? When they interview people, when they go around town, when they talk to people, like they put themselves a little bit in the story as the storyteller, as the narrator, and talk to people. And typically Gonzo is pretty raw in its style. It doesn't like try to smooth over any edges. It just says exactly what people were saying and whether or not it makes them look good or bad. In hindsight, if you were to go back and read the article, it isn't. I honestly, it's bad, but it's not like trying to be bad. It's more like social acceptance of furry fandom at that time was not great. So if you're giving a first person representation of how people saw furries at that time, then it's probably pretty accurate. There was one part of the story where I recall they were talking to like basically non-furry couple, a non-furry group in that Chicago area during that convention. And if you want to know how old this article is, like they literally give the attendance records for Midwest Fur Fest, and they said 400 people were in attendance. 400. Yeah, so back then, not a lot of people went to furry conventions, and it's like orders of magnitude lower, right? It's actually like if you'd have to multiply that by what, like 4,000 for 40, I think. You'd have to multiply it by quite a bit. It's orders of magnitude smaller than it currently is. My math's not mathing in my brain right now, which is great because that's supposed to be my thing. But anyways, Gonzo style. That's basically what it was. It was a Gonzo style piece. Now, a lot of furries blame these kind of articles for the rough shot that they got in the early 2000s because it's the thing that introduced furry into the, mainstream readers and stuff like that. So obviously it didn't feel like the right foot for many furries. And the interesting thing is, so Vanity Fair gave a raw, unsalacious, unsolicited, just go in there and talk about the furries. And even the adult stuff, even the stuff that, it would make, your grandma blush or whatever. So cool. But there's a problem. And this goes into the kind of media environment that was back then. 2 years later, an article was released by Vanity Fair. The coverage, Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah, the one and only. In March of 2003, exactly 2 years after the release of the Salacious Furry article, we had The Talented Mr. Epstein, which was written by one Vicky Ward. And I'm going to put an asterisk on that. And we're going to go over the asterisk in a bit. Basically, this piece talked about this mysterious person who seemed to be connected with the who's who, the socialites, as it were, in the time. The Clintons, the Gates, all the who's who of the power brokers of the early 2000s. And as we all know, there was a bit of a dark side to that tie. There was a bit of salacious human trafficking going on behind the social networking. And as we all know, Jeffrey Epstein was and now I'm explaining who the guy is and what happened in a way. Most furries probably already know who they are. Most people probably already know who they are. But for those who are not, who live just furry for escapism, my apologies first off for bringing this topic here. But the individual in question basically ran a trafficking ring of basically abuse of minors and other such things. Very horrible stuff. Very nasty, nasty stuff. Stuff that is blood boiling and frustrating. And a lot of people were tied up with this guy that, there were heroes of the time. And it's frustrating to see how sort of blasé, like their connection with him was, and how just like how much they like engaged with him even after it was known, because like it was the late 2000s when Mr. Epstein actually started to get caught and actually was like convicted of a crime. He did a little bit of time, probably not enough time, but obviously he got arrested later in 2019, which ended up being his last arrest because he died in prison under circumstances, a lot of people believe that, people in power, he knew stuff about people in power that they didn't want him, that the people in power didn't want knowing. So just so happened, to be put in a situation where, his sentence wasn't fully served. That being said, at the end of the day, people know who this guy is. Now, the 2003 piece basically was pretty clean. Now, before you start saying, well, Vanity Fair couldn't have known at the time. Vanity Fair, the furries were just out and about showing that, hey, we're weird, and here's some adult kinky stuff that we like, and that Epstein was probably clean, and that people didn't know who he was because he was hiding it. And that's not true. And that's the part where it all comes together, right? While Vanity Fair was using the furry freak show to throw salacious meats to their readership, they were protecting a billionaire in the most real sense. A month ago, that author, Vicky Ward, if you remember her name, did an interview with Amy Goodman, I think her name is, Amy Goodman, I believe, from Democracy Now! And in that interview, she discussed how she had found a lead in that story around a victim, and that she presented it in her article, and she had finalized the article. She had submitted it for publication to her editor, and I will let her quote finish that story. As we were closing the piece, a fact checker sent me a note saying, "You're not going to believe who's in the office of Vanity Fair." She's a British person, so you got to have a little flair. It was Jeffrey Epstein, meeting with Greg and Carter, the editor of the magazine. I do not know what was said in that meeting. I will say, Amy, that I was at home at bed rest, about to give birth to 2 twins. I thought we were done with this piece. I did find in the Epstein files that when the first batch was released, that there was a section in a binder containing photographs that was called Vanity Fair. I did notice that the photographs in that binder, in that section, were the ones that were used to accompany my piece in the magazine, which is very unusual because Vanity Fair normally prides itself on its photography as well as it does its words. So one has to assume that Epstein and Maxwell provided the photographs. One has to ask, what was the quid pro quo? When my piece finally ran, the Farmer sisters and their allegations were not in it. So the Farmer sisters is one of the first public victims to come forward. Unfortunately, their story wouldn't be shared under that Vanity Fair article. If you notice, there's a bunch of blocks in the quote. And so this is I'm going to cover some nonfiction little nuance here in case you're not aware. This isn't direct quotes. This is a direct quote except for things that are kind of in the brackets and things like that. I kind of did some cleanup. There's some crosstalk. There's going to be a video, and the video is going to be in the description below. This quote is at the 11-minute and 17 mark. And basically, because there's some crosstalk, she says it was Jeffrey Epstein, and then Amy says meeting with, and then she says Grade and Carter, right? So there's some crosstalk between Amy and and Vicky going on, which I kind of clean up to put into her own quotes with the things. And like she said, like, assume that they provided the photographs, so I replaced that with Epstein and Maxwell so that there's context. So that's basically what you use those brackets for. And if you didn't know, now you know. But so an interesting thing about it also is that after this particular part, I'm summarizing the rest of the conversation in a bit. But basically, Vicky said that, about the piece, the FBI had contacted her about the interview that she did with the victims. And, it didn't really follow up with anything. So, and when the piece released, obviously the story wasn't gone. And so Vicky felt bad about the fact that she had sort of outed the victims to the perpetrator, that they were talking so that he could run defense. And she really didn't get anything out of it. But one of the interesting things to note about that is that Vicky did an interview with the FBI about Jeffrey Epstein. And according to Vicky, she looked at the files and didn't see any interview with her about Jeffrey Epstein. So that's got to exist somewhere. And it was not released to the public as per that law to release those files. So as we can see here, it is very important. Nonfiction is essential. It is an important part of community. It relies on people doing things in good faith, irregardless of the consequences of people who have power or money. And it is essential. Now, here's the thing. As a person in nonfiction, you'll run into characters and build rapport. You might build rapport with people who aren't the most saintly and clean, right? But to me, it's sort of a thing where you shouldn't be gaining rapport just for power and influence or to be on the good graces of somebody with power and influence. And being intimidated by kind of the power that they hold. And this is sort of a problem with, covering things and covering nonfiction, is that it's kind of, it can be easily manipulated by a person who has that kind of power. And as is put in the published version of the article, if you go and read it, basically the person who was the CEO of Vanity Fair at the time, was Canadian. The investigative journalist was British, and they protected an American billionaire. Global in its reach and its scope, in that one meeting, in that one room, and that one decision by that CEO had basically opened the doors to the darkest chapters of American history. One of our darkest chapters of like a cover-up that lasted longer than it possibly should have, and caused more problems as a result. You have to ask yourself this question. If Donald Trump is deeply ingrained in the files, as many suspect, and it seems that like things are pointing that way, given how much he's in the files and how much like it's known that they were best friends, and how much is known about that, and obviously with him leading the administration that enacts enforcement of the law, there's very much a conflict of interest when it comes to being able to rely on the government for that, especially since Vicky gave that quote, and especially given things that we'll cover in the next video about the views that the things I've seen. And it's still related to furry, don't worry. But here's the thing, like that one vote, that one decision in that office in Vanity Fair has given us the present that we're in now. Because had they run the article without redacting the victim's story, what could have been a much different thing. Think about this. It was 2003. It was the Bush administration second year of the War on Terror. Donald Trump, while powerful, was still a bit off-kiltered. He wasn't popular enough to win the presidency. He wanted to be it even back then. He had this dream of being it. I think even back then, I think everything in his life he sort of pushed towards it in his own way. But it wasn't until the mid 2000s, after that Epstein article had published the way it published, that the show The Apprentice basically ingrained itself in the millennial generation's vernacular. It made Donald Trump into a household name. It paved the way for his eventual victory in politics. Rattling and frustrated at the world of corruption and people in power, because he knows all too well about the corruption of people in power. Probably a bit too well, as we've come to find. But what would have happened had the FBI pushed harder into that story earlier, after it's published, right? What would have, would the Bush administration even give a dang about Donald Trump? Donald Trump was basically elbow to elbow with Democrats at the time. He's good friends with Bill Clinton before he didn't care for his wife running against him in the presidential election. So could it have turned out differently had that been nipped in the bud right then and there? Could it have accelerated Epstein's fall? And if it accelerated Epstein's fall, would it have brought to bear more openly the situation occurring between the people who were popular at the time and the powers that be at the time? It would have been a whole different world. And it's crazy to think about that. It's crazy to realize that. And but we are in the present how we are. But I think in that present, what we do with this gift and this gift of knowledge is that we should just call Vanity Fair what it is. A pedoprotector publication that we should turn away from and do anything that we can because if that's the only power that we got, that's the only power that we got. There's not much we can do about getting rid of a president as citizens. There's not much other than voting, right? And protecting our rights to vote. There's not much we can do about this corruption in the system. But what we can do is send a message to the publication that allowed this to happen in the first place. We need to ensure that what happened in Vanity Fair doesn't happen in any other publication. And if Vanity Fair needs to go, then it needs to go. So I don't ask much of people, and I don't usually push for politics, but I think that's something that everyone can agree on that needs to happen here in results of this. Vanity Fair needs to go. They should not go unscathed for that decision to protect Mr. Epstein. Whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, I don't care. Nonfiction has a purpose. Its purpose is to inform people, even if that information is hard to take. Thank you very much for watching. Do the algorithm stuff if you wish. Next video, we're going to cover another Epstein video, unfortunately. And as I said, I'm going to keep it tied with furry. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the files. But we're going to limit our jurisdiction. We're only looking for furry stuff. And I found the word furry in there 74 times. So we'll go over what those words meant. Spoiler alert, not too much of the fandom directly, but I believe it's an interesting thing to go over. And I think many furries would be interested in seeing it. If you want to read it, quit now. There's an article in the description that goes over that full thing. And the next part will cover that aspect of it. Thank you guys very much for watching. Sorry for the frustration on this one. Have a good one.